So Elliot Temple pointed out that this post on Reddit exists. I guess this is the Sam Harris subreddit. And this person says that they emailed David Deutsch, who is the person who wrote Fabric of Reality and The Beginning of Infinity, and is a physicist and Paparian, and who is a big proponent of taking children seriously and used to be really into philosophy and stuff. And so this person, Ranting Mute, emailed David Deutsch about Ayn Rand. And he says, David responded. And so I'm just going to go through this email, this reply from David, and see what I have to say about it. So the first thing he says is, I admire Ayn Rand, but not as a philosopher. So this strikes me as David sort of trying to bury the attack a bit with some initial niceness, or superficial niceness. Like, he's not saying Ayn Rand sucks, I don't like her philosophy. Or just even like, I do not admire Ayn Rand as a philosopher. Like this ordering, I think, is significant, because trying to make it difficult to disagree with David, because if like you take offense to this, and I mean offense in like an intellectual way, like you have a strong reaction to this based on your judgment of her philosophy, then maybe that comes off as weird because to like third parties, because hey, David said he admires Ayn Rand, just not as a philosopher. But like, that's what she was, and that's what she carried herself as. Like, is both it was factually true and it's what she purported to be. So this is sort of, accusing her of fraud in a way, and I think this is engaging in some social nicety. And then the next part I think is really interesting. So I just wrote a couple of notes about what I said, because I think I might make this a blog post or an email or something. There's going to be some written work product from this video. So the other thing is, like, this is super broad. David knows how to write and could have qualified his rejection of Ayn Rand, like her ideas, in a variety of ways. He could have said, I don't admire her as an epistemologist, or as an ethical philosopher, or as like whatever part of her philosophy he wanted to take exception to and say, I disagree with that. Like, there's a way to say you like someone, you think they had some good ideas, you think they were an interesting thinker, but you don't agree with everything they said. But he says he doesn't admire her as a philosopher, which means, he doesn't admire her as a thinker. And so in the broadest sense. So this is I think a very broad rejection of Ayn Rand, and it's meant to be. He meant to uh, attack her like very broadly, and he buries it a bit because it's after it's after the butt. Um, but it's still a very broad uh, rejection of her. And so the other thing is, so he wants to indicate this like total rejection of her, but he won't discuss the issue with like Ayn Rand advocates, which he has plenty of access to. So, and he's replying to somebody's like random email instead of doing like intentionally public writing that he could get criticism on. If he wanted to take a philosophical and, rigorous critical approach to his ideas about Ayn Rand, that's what he would do. But instead he attacks her in private emails that get passed along in Reddit threads. So, okay, so I think I'm done with my thoughts on the first sentence. So let's move on to the next one. So David says, as an observer of people and of some of the pervasive irrationalities and hang-ups of our culture, especially the ones she somewhat misleadingly calls altruism, she was outstanding. Now, there's a couple of thoughts that I have here. One is more writing, and one is more substantive. So let me start with the writing one and just get that out of the way. This is quite a thing to put in a parenthetical. There better be an explanation coming, is all I can say, because Rand certainly had thoughts, like detailed, worked out, very elaborated at length thoughts on altruism and morality, and then he's just sort of saying that she misleadingly called certain things altruism when she explicitly articulated why at length, defended her specific use of that specific term. So that's one problem. So I'm just going to be, I'm trying a bit of a different video strategy this time, at least with this video, where I'm talking out loud and then sort of forming the thought that I want to say in speech, and then I'm going to pause the video while I type stuff out. So I won't say that I'm doing that from here on out. You'll just like the video will pause, and then you'll just see some writing appear on the screen. And this is sort of my alternative to using certain silence removal methods. I'm just doing the silence removal essentially manually as I go, to the extent I can, using hotkeys to pause and restart the video. So our culture does have, of course, pervasive irrationalities and hang-ups of all sorts, which David has written about in terms of memes. And the overwhelming majority of people do not think about them much, do not even notice them really, don't really observe them, don't criticize them, don't challenge them, don't think about how some of the things they believe contradict other things, don't consider better ways to be, better ways to exist. They lead the unexamined life. Now, if you are an observer, if you can successfully note and talk about the pervasive irrationalities and hang-ups of our culture, that indicates some philosophical skill. They're pervasive because there are certain ideas that are good at creating blind spots in people and getting passed on. So it's a real impressive, creative, powerful act of a human mind to notice and be able to criticize some of these. And note that he doesn't just say that she was okay or she was pretty good. He says she was outstanding. I don't know if this is like social praise where he's trying to, lay it on thick before he attacks her again. Like he was doing this stuff at the beginning. But to be able to observe the pervasive irrationalities and hangups of our culture to an outstanding degree is a skill. And what sort of person has that skill? A thinker, a philosopher. So I think that essentially David is already contradicting himself in a way because he says he admires Ayn Rand, but not as a philosopher. And I think this is supposed to be the reason or the beginning of his explanation of the reason that he says he admires her. And yet the very thing that he's submitting into evidence as the basis for his admiration is something which requires philosophical skill. One thing I think is interesting here, by the way, is because I really focused on this part, but David actually puts people first. And I think that's interesting because Ayn Rand, she was a great observer of people, and her characterizations, particularly, like her characterizations of her heroes are great, but her characterizations of her like, like the bad people. I didn't even want to really say villains, because there is like one real villain, I guess. I'm thinking of Tui, but a lot of them are just like they're just sort of crappy people. But anyway, like she really does understand and get certain psychological motivations of people to an incredible degree. But I think the order isn't quite right here because I guess I'm sure she saw some people doing stuff that didn't make sense and then thought of reasons why that might be. But it's the thinking, like she figured out the principle, like, what Rourke calls the principle of the dean. She figured out the principle of various types of people through philosophical reflection, and then went back to the people that she observed in reality and was able to figure out what was going on there. So it's ordering by emphasizing the people, it's sort of downplaying the philosophical analysis element because it's putting the people first. And again, like I want to be clear, she wasn't just an observer of people. See, even the word, right? Even the word is significant here because observation is not quite right. Like she did observe, but she didn't just observe. She explained people. She was an explainer of people, and I think that is not a word that DD would want to use here, even though I think it would be more accurate because it would bring in tension. It would bring the tension in his analysis where he's trying to do some praise of Rand for something that requires philosophical skill while also trashing her as not being a philosopher. It would make that contradiction more clear, I think. All right, on to the third sentence. So David says, as a polemical writer criticizing these irrationalities and exposing the harm they do, she was excellent and persuasive. And again, same as before, to be able to criticize irrationalities that are What did he say? Oh, I have it right here. Irrationalities and hang-ups of our culture that are pervasive, you need philosophical skill. And to expose the harm they do, again, that's not something that's apparent to a lot of people. The harm of pursuing the second-handed life, the harm of living your life for the sake of others, the harm of putting altruism into practice at a political level, and the destructive effects of doing that on society, on the economy. All not obvious stuff. This is all stuff that requires thinking, a thinker, philosophical skill. And again, and I find this so interesting that, again, at the top, I admire Ayn Rand, but not as a philosopher, but she's in an outstanding way observing these irrationalities and hang-ups, and in an excellent and persuasive way criticizing these irrationalities and exposing the harm they do. Like, this just seems very contradictory to me. Because I don't think that David has like a very narrow, technical, academically oriented definition of what a philosopher is. He knows that, so he should know that the things he's describing are the activities of a philosopher, of a thinker. But yet he's framing it like this is his long, introductory praise before he explains why Ayn Rand sucks, presumably, as a philosopher. So it's just weird. So next sentence. And her optimism and pro-human stances are refreshing and inspiring and true. And that's fine as far as it goes. It's a bit light on details. I mean, the whole thing has been a bit light on details so far in terms of actually engaging with what Rand thinks, except for this very brief aside that's unexplained, referring to altruism. But like, yeah, she was optimistic. I mean, in a way, like she thought human potential was, extraordinary. She was not very optimistic about that potential being realized if people evade, and she saw lots of evasion. Also, part of her pro-human stance is rejecting altruism, which David seems to take exception to. But I have the least to say about this part of any part so far. So, this, I went to Ayn Rand lexicon, and just the entry on altruism in order to give some indication of how Rand regarded it in terms of human life. She says, the irreducible primary of altruism, the basic absolute, is self-sacrifice, which means self-immolation, self-abnegation, self-denial, self-destruction, which means the self as the standard of evil, the selfless as the standard of the good. Do not hide behind such superficialities as whether or not you should give a dime to a beggar. That is not the issue. The issue is whether you do or do not have the right to exist without giving him that dime. The issue is whether you must keep buying your life dime by dime from any beggar who might choose to approach you. The issue is whether the needs of others is the first mortgage on your life and the moral purpose of your existence. The issue is whether man is to be regarded as a sacrificial animal. Any man of self-esteem will answer no. Altruism answers yes. So that's part of her being pro-human. So the next bit, so here's the but. So David says, but she had a strong tendency to make hyperbolic generalizations and to double down on them with nonsense in order to deflect any potential criticism. So I'm going to mostly comment on the stuff following, but like even like it looks like just glancing at the rest of this that David's only giving one quote, and one quote would not establish a strong tendency. You know, even if the example stood for the proposition that David claims, you would need more than one to establish this how people conventionally interpret strong tendency. So let's continue with David Deutsch's case against Ayn Rand. In addition to my point about strong tendency, I also just wrote that basically David is lying because he's calling it nonsense, which for someone of his like philosophical background, reputation, status, it indicates that he made some sort of good faith effort to determine that it was nonsense. But like he hasn't made reasonable good faith efforts to get different perspectives from people who say like Rand, and go through some of the things he thinks are nonsense and try and figure out whether they actually are nonsense. But I think calling it nonsense is kind of a lie. So David starts, consider dispassionately if you can. And I'm going to, because I think even the if you can here is like a nasty sort of an aside attack. Like what follows is so ridiculous that you probably won't be able to consider it dispassionately. The way Rand is really good at getting people angry at her and riled up because she points out things that apply to them and they know it at some level, and so then they engage in these sort of pseudo like these rationalizations in order to attack her. So maybe, I don't know, David couldn't consider it dispassionately, so he's trying to give helpful advice to others. So David says, in no case and in no situation may one permit. So this is okay. Actually skipped over. So just consider dispassionately, if you can, whether the following statement is true or false. And then Rand says, in no case and in no situation may one permit one's own values to be attacked or denounced and keep silent. So David continues after this Rand quote, the thing is, if literally true, this is a profound discovery in moral philosophy with dramatic practical implications. But if it is merely a maxim that is true in a certain vaguely defined set of circumstances, and her idea is that people often defer to social convention when they shouldn't, then it is unoriginal and unspectacular, though arguably useful in a self-help book sort of way. So this is very nasty and vicious and not engaging with Rand in the spirit of David may be wrong and Rand may be right, and then by an effort, maybe even though Rand isn't around, David and some of the advocates of Rand's philosophy can get to the truth. That's not the spirit he's approaching interpreting this passage in. But what problem is Rand trying to deal with? Since David didn't try to engage with Rand fairly and honestly, I'll try and do some of that here in this video for him. Rand was trying to deal with the issue of how to maintain your life, your reason, your mind in a society that's irrational and that has lots of pressures to be irrational and to give in. And the thing that she says is that you need to judge and prepare to be judged. One must never fail to pronounce moral judgment. And in discussing that idea, that's where she talks about this. That's where she makes this statement. And both the paragraph and the paragraph that this is the end of this quote and the paragraph that immediately precedes it give a lot of context. So I'm just going to read through those briefly. So keep in mind, she says you always need to pronounce moral judgment. So what does that mean? The policy of always pronouncing moral judgment does not mean that you must regard oneself as a missionary charged with the responsibility of saving everyone's soul, nor that one must give unsolicited moral appraisals to all those one meets. It means, A, that one must know clearly, in full, verbally identified form, one's own moral evaluation of every person, issue, and event with which one deals, and act accordingly. B, that one must make one's moral evaluation known to others when it is rationally appropriate to do so. This last means that one need not launch into unprovoked moral denunciations or debates, but that one must speak up in situations where silence can objectively be taken to mean agreement with or sanction of evil. When one deals with irrational persons, where argument is futile, a mere "I don't agree with you" is sufficient to negate any implication of moral sanction. When one deals with better people, a full statement of one's views may be morally required. But in no case and in no situation may one permit one's own values to be attacked or denounced and keep silent. So, what is the context here? Rand is trying to offer advice to people on how to have integrity, on how to maintain independent judgment. And she says you need to engage in judgment, and you need to do that clearly. You can't be like, oh, well, maybe what this person's doing not so bad, different strokes for different folks. If it works for them but not for me, that's okay. No, you have to judge. I mean, you need to go on random tirades to people who don't want to hear it. That doesn't mean you have to do stupid stuff that would be against your life and your self-defense, like telling the Nazis about your Jewish values or something. But it does mean that you should form judgments of situations and people, at least in your own mind. Then, at least in the context of a civilized society, you shouldn't just, so again, excluding like emergency situations, excluding when you're being persecuted by the Nazis, all that sort of stuff. In the context of a civilized society, if people are saying something which you think is horrible, you don't laugh along with them at whatever horrible thing they're saying. You say, I don't agree with you. And I think that could be enough. The benefit there is for you. It's not like one thing that I think, like, people take a very sort of duty approach to morality, but like you have to keep your values alive, you have to live them. And in the context of interacting with others and talking about things, that means speaking up for them. It's a general principle that you should follow in a civilized society. Now, if David says, if it is merely a maxim that is true in a certain vaguely defined set of circumstances, it's not vaguely defined. It's basically like, if it's not an emergency situation where like your life might be threatened if Antifa knows you're a capitalist or something, then you must speak up. And this I think warrants very careful reading and interpretation. One must speak up in situations where silence can objectively be taken to mean agreement with or sanction of evil. This is absolute, and it's not letting me highlight it because they have some stupid JavaScript thing or something probably, but this is absolutely, maybe that'll, okay. This is absolutely key, because there are times where somebody says something and it's just like they go off on a political rant in a situation, in a circumstance where that's not really an appropriate thing to do. and people get sort of like, annoyed with that. Although in the US we're becoming like, it seems like almost every, like, people just bring up politics all the time in any situation, and it's just normal now. But at least still that's a thing. Um and so if you don't say anything in that situation, more like, I don't know, it's like you're at work and somebody goes off on a 15-minute rant about whatever politician they don't like, and it's textually inappropriate to do that, and nobody is going to nobody would interpret your silence objectively in a reasonable way as agreement. They would just be happy that the topic is getting dropped. Then you don't even need to get to, I don't agree with you necessarily. Like, even then, it's even optional. The situation where your silence can reasonably be interpreted as agreement, sanction, consent to the point being discussed, whatever, then yeah, you should speak up, unless, there's some really serious consequence that would follow from doing so. That's not a vaguely defined set of circumstances. That's a clear general policy for interactions within the context of a civilized society, in the circumstance where not speaking up could reasonably be taken as agreement. So I just wanted to highlight this stuff. So this is from the Ethics of Emergencies essay in The Virtue of Selfishness, which is the same book that the bit that DD quotes from Rand is drawn from. And so I was reviewing the essay that the quote is from, that DD uses, and there's a connection here, I think, because when Rand says that you should make your moral evaluation known to others when it is rationally appropriate to do so, that excludes like an emergency sort of situation. And she talks about emergency situations at length. And I bring this up because while David hasn't really specified, at least at the part of his little email that I've gotten to, I think dramatic practical implications, when he says that her statement has dramatic practical implications, like he's trying to say, maybe you would have to, as a Jew to the Nazis or something. But Rand says very clearly, it's important to differentiate between the rules of conduct in an emergency situation and the rules of conduct in the normal conditions of human existence. This does not mean a double standard of morality. The standard and the basic principles remain the same, but their application to either case requires precise definitions. And so you have something where, you're being oppressed, that's an emergency situation, and so it's an act of self-defense to lie in that situation. It's necessary for your life and your survival in a context where you're, facing violent oppression, to lie to people who want to hurt you. That is not the same situation as, somebody or a group of people that start saying stuff that you strongly disagree with, and the situation is such that if you don't say anything, they'll just assume that you agree. And so the basic idea that I'm sort of citing this for is, there's what's appropriate to do in an emergency is a little different than how you would act in the ordinary course in a civilized society with people that aren't like trying to murder you. And here she's talking about floods, earthquakes, fires, shipwrecks, temporary in nature, human survival is impossible. But I think you could also include like some brutal, tyrannical, murderous regime, which also make human survival impossible and are, you know, limited in nature and time, although depending on what the external world to them does, they can linger for quite a while. By the way, just a side note that silence can actually be taken as acceptance in certain circumstances in like contract law, even. Oh, it's not super common, but it happens. Like this novel thing that Rand is bringing up, this idea that there are certain circumstances where silence can be taken as agreement. And her basic idea is if you're in such a situation and it's a normal situation where it's not like, some sort of emergency or something, then you should speak up. And David derides this as vaguely defined set of circumstances. And he says, oh, unoriginal, unspectacular. It was very interesting, by the way, like the shift. Like we went from she's like outstanding, excellent, and persuasive at stuff to unoriginal, unspectacular self-help book. But anyways, I think the standard is defined pretty clearly. The issue is the application of the standard to the variety of human experience, like determining the idea that you should speak up when your silence could be taken to mean agreement with evil. That's pretty clear. And I think that's something actually a lot of people would agree with. The issue is it can be more complicated to determine when that actually is. Trying to make that determination could reasonably err on either side, either speaking up maybe more than is strictly necessary or not speaking up enough. But one of the big problems that people have, and that I think Rand was trying to help out with her helpful advice, is that people in our culture, in our society, err very, very, very heavily on not speaking up enough when they should, because they're intimidated, because they're afraid, because they don't form moral judgments. They avoid the formation of moral judgments in the first place. And so they feel like they don't have, a judgment to go on, to think something is bad, because they avoid forming it, because they're afraid of the consequences of having a moral judgment, which views people or things as negative. Other people or the culture as a whole view positively. By the way, and I might have said this before, I'm recording this on a different day than the first part of the video. But one thing that bothers me is that David talks about dramatic practical implications of what presumably is his, misreading of this quote, but he doesn't say what he thinks they are. And that creates a problem for me as a critic. And it's almost like kind of an intentional thing, I wonder, in a way, because if he put a specific problem that he thought this statement created out there, then I or somebody like me could read it and either say why he's mistaken that it causes that problem, or why it's not actually a problem, or whatever. But if he keeps it vague in terms of dramatic practical implications, and then I raise something like, being a Jew and having your Jewish values attacked by the Nazis, then David, or more likely somebody like a fan of his defending him on Reddit or something, because I don't think he'll directly reply to me, but David or a fan of his can say, oh, no, he wasn't saying that. He had this other case in mind. Um, and so that's a problem with not writing a more thorough, serious criticism, not having a way of having follow up discussion when you deal with intellectual issues in a way where you trash great thinkers in email asides to fans where there's no possibility really of getting like further follow up or clarification. That's a real issue, and it creates issues for critics. And I do wonder if it's like an intentional thing where he's raising the barriers to be able to pin him down, which is frustrating and which is not a truth-seeking attitude. By the way, I just had a thought that the silence thing, the not um the speaking up when silence can be objectively taken to mean agreement with or sanction of evil. That's just, I think that that's like a subcase or special case or a particular applied example of the general thing, um, that one shouldn't permit one's own values to be attacked or denounced and keep silent. I mean, these are closely related, but, and this is just thinking aloud here, like, I wondered if maybe this was a bit, like, broader of a statement of the idea. Although now that I'm reading it again, maybe they're pretty equivalent. I'm not sure. Just a thought. Maybe somebody watching the video will have a thought about whether this is sort of a restatement of what Rand said earlier. Maybe this is worth saying. Like, I think definitely Rand would also say, like, directly agree with evil either. Like, if you're somebody who supports Trump and people are bashing Trump, like, you shouldn't, and again, it's a normal sort of situation, and people will interpret your silence reasonably as agreement. You shouldn't be silent, says Rand. You also definitely shouldn't be like, oh, F Trump. Like, that's not better than silence just because you're not being silent. And I think that's less common than silence, but I think it's definitely something that happens. Like, I read stuff about people joining in bashing Trump at the office, especially nowadays. There's such social pressure to bash Trump that people just sort of go along with like the 2 minute hate at the office, because that's what everybody's doing, and they don't really have strong opinions, even if they voted for him. Like, they don't have strong opinions that they're willing to defend publicly against social pressure, uh, and have, you know, people be unpleasant about. A bunch of writing happened like behind the scenes, by the way. But here I'm just giving like a dictionary definition of permit or permit. Give authorization or consent to someone to do something. And I think that's a reasonable one for this quote, the big quote, regarding permitting one's own values to be attacked or denounced. Because, Rand had brought up silence equals agreement, which is about basically giving other people, in context, the green light through your silence to trash your values. And she's saying, don't do that. But, and I think I said something like this before, but like if somebody's just going off on their stuff, but it's not a situation where people would reasonably interpret you as agreeing with them if you're just silent, then that's fine to be silent. Thinking of like the Nick Sandman stuff where the guy, just smiled at the Indian who I think misrepresented his service record and was banging a drum in his face, and like his, the Nick's like fellow students had been getting harassed by these fringe extremist black Israelites who like to shout out white people in DC a lot. Anyway, Nick was just standing there and smiling, and that was blown up as him, I don't know, being aggressive or something. But it was definitely not taken as agreement with the Native Americans. So Nick was fine as far as that was concerned. Nobody took his silence as consent. So here I'm just summing up what I think is the point. Right, just the point of this quote in context, which is people need to form judgments about people, events, and issues around them. People should share these judgments when it is rationally appropriate to do so. And in a normal situation in a civilized society, one should speak up and defend one's values when silence could be taken as agreement. This you can mostly get from like the preceding two paragraphs, like the paragraph the quote is in and the one that is immediately before it. And then there's a little bit that maybe requires more background familiarity with Ren's thought, but it's not super hard. And yet, that pretty straightforward set of stuff is what Didi calls nonsense. So, reading Rand as he does in an untruth seeking way, Didi had just said regarding this quote that if it's literally true, it's a profound discovery in philosophy with dramatic consequences or implications, which he does not specify or give an example of. But if it is merely a maxim that is true in a certain vaguely defined set of circumstances, yada yada, then it is unoriginal and spectacular. She intends the latter meaning, but expresses it in terms suggesting the former. So basically, he's calling her sort of a liar, a fraud, who's offering, vague, unclear, unoriginal, unspectacular self-help book pap, and passing it off as moral philosophy. So then David continues, as polemic or rhetoric, that's great. As philosophy, it's embarrassing wannabe stuff. And again, David is coming off as somebody who has considered rational, thoughtful opinions on this matter of whether Rand's philosophy is, embarrassing wannabe stuff, whether the quote that he's citing is, embarrassing wannabe stuff and is representative of her philosophy and all that sort of stuff. He wants to convey an aura of authority on that question, but he hasn't engaged who could offer criticism. He hasn't engaged with, Eliot Temple or Alan Forrester or various objectivists. There's no paths forward here. So this is a fraudulent assertion as to the rigor and methods that went into establishing this position of his. He wants to indicate that he knows what he's talking about, but he hasn't done the work to actually know what he's talking about here. He's just spewing attacks, spewing nastiness. All right, so David continues. In regard to fundamental philosophical theory, she was hopelessly incompetent and confused. Just fuck this guy, man, All right. So I actually skipped a paragraph by accident of David's stuff. So David says, she was ironically obsessed with attributes of people rather than of ideas. So this is more vague attacks. This is weird. Rand's philosophy was very idea oriented, and she actually promoted the idea of focusing on people less. Reality orientedness as opposed to people orientedness is a big theme of objectivism. Second handedness, which is when you're focused on other people and wanting to please others, wanting to please the group, getting your values and goals from them, is something that's criticized very heavily in objectivism. The Fountainhead, if I recall, was originally called like secondhand lives. Objectivism actually has like different terms for the concept, even like there's social metaphysicians, there's secondhandedness. Even like some of the negative stereotypes of objectivists don't really conform to this. Like there's objectivists can be seen as kind of robotic, or what people might call like autistic or whatever, which I disagree with that very strongly. But that's what they might say, um, and very focused on logic and rational principles and wanting. And I think focusing on logic and rational principles is fine, but there's like this negative stereotype where you're just sort of a Randbot that is saying Rand's ideas and wanting to have a logical proof for everything or something like that. I don't know, but it doesn't really conform with obsessed with attributes of people. I noticed because above he was attacking her philosophy. Now he's talking about Rand personally. I was just talking about people following her philosophy on the thought that like maybe he's trying to bash her philosophy by saying it implies a certain way of being. But now that I look at this again, this is just like this is trying to refute her philosophy by attacking her. This is just ad hominem. Like even if Rand sucked, and even if Rand sucked in the ways that Dee says she did, and I think neither of those is true. But even if those were true, you'd still have to judge her ideas on their own merit, for their own sake, as opposed to being like, well, she sucked, so. All right. So David continues, that's why her followers tend to form themselves into groups with insider outsider ideologies, somewhat unfairly called cults by her detractors. Now, the first thing I'm going to comment on is this somewhat unfairly, because somewhat unfairly is a very nasty attack, pretending not to be. This is more fake niceness from David, like when he said he admires Rand at the beginning. Because basically, he's saying, because if it's somewhat unfairly, it's partially fairly. But if you take offense to this, somebody might say, well, but he said it was somewhat unfair, so why are you giving him such a hard time? So he's saying it's partially fair that objectivist groups are called cults, which, like, this is just so evil and vicious, I don't even know what to say. You know, part of the problem with a lot of objectivist groups is that they don't take Rand's philosophy seriously enough. They sort of are. They're sort of, a lot of them are kind of like mild Rand fan reading groups slash local like Republican club or something. Like they're really quite mild. And I don't mean that. I don't mean that as a compliment. I think it'd be better if they were less mild and more hard edged and ideological and serious. But that's what they are. And there's enormous cultural pressure against taking ideas seriously and living to them. And there's enormous cultural pressure to just want to go with the flow and go with the cultural norm and not think too deeply about life and all that. And if you go against that and you live according to a certain set of values, even if you're a member of a fairly large religious group, like say Mormons or something, that's actually pretty innocuous as far as, minority religious groups go, people will think that's really weird. And that's part of what the cult thing is about. So smearing objectivists as being somewhat fairly characterized as cults, actually, it's participating in cultural pressure against taking ideas seriously and living according to them, which is disgusting. So, just going through a few things quickly, I did a bunch of writing. Yeah. So David says that Rand's that Rand underestimated. See, he says she underestimated the resilience of American and Anglosphere institutions, and indeed underrated the importance of institutions generally. And so my thought was, by what basis, or I guess on what basis, does Dee think Rand underrated the resilience of American institutions? He doesn't actually say. So again, I'm arguing in the dark here because he gives so few details of what his reasoning is. And I think it's interesting. Like, this email is not written to satisfy a serious critic. It's written to satisfy someone who's not going to push back a lot. I happen to have, I had this email call to my attention because it was posted publicly and somebody happened to see it. So, and I pushed back a lot, but David expected this, was satisfy a not very rigorous critic. Anyway, so he doesn't give details, but my guess is maybe it's because she wrote Atlas Shrugged and there's a depiction of a collapsing society there. But she wrote that so that that wouldn't occur, like that, she, to try and be helpful. Not, she wasn't saying that it was inevitable. She saw certain bad trends, even in, decades ago, and especially starting in the 60s, which, you could say she kind of saw SJWs like 50, 60 years ahead of when they actually became a real force. Because she saw and understood the importance of ideas. But that doesn't mean that she underestimated the resilience of American institutions. This is a quote from the essay Theory and Practice in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal from Rand. So it says, it took centuries of intellectual philosophical development to achieve political freedom. It was a long struggle stretching from Aristotle to John Locke to the Founding Fathers. The system they established was not based on unlimited majority rule, but on its opposite, on individual rights, which were not to be alienated by majority vote or minority plotting. The individual was not left at the mercy of his neighbors or his leaders. The constitutional system of checks and balances was scientifically devised to protect him from both. This was the great American achievement. And if concern for the actual welfare of other nations were our present leaders' motive, this is what we should have been teaching the world. So, Rand was somebody that had enormous respect for American institutions. She was worried that they could be like corroded, eroded, potentially destroyed by bad ideas, by bad ideologies. And she had reason to fear that. And they have been greatly eroded, and our rights have greatly been eroded, and government has continued to grow. and debt has continued to grow, and the left has become more radical, and many things have gotten worse. But Rand absolutely respected American institutions. Dee Dee's so nasty, by the way. Calling her hopelessly incompetent and confused. Her main, perhaps her only innovation. And then he says something about her, advocacy for free markets, which that's always the thing. And I wrote about this a little bit. That's always the thing that people kind of concede, like, oh, she's a really strong advocate for free markets, because it's like they never, when they're talking about some part of objectivism that they'll concede has some merit, it's always politics or economics. They never talk about like themes like second-handedness, stuff that cuts closer to the core of like people's motivations, people's sort of core being in a way. They always keep it at a higher level. And I think it's because, talking about politics, economics, like that's not really threatening to people's lives and psychology. Like you can be a free market advocate and be somewhat respectable, but you can't like understand Rand's ideas about second-handedness and think them through in a rigorous way and then carry on with your life where you're going to social climbing parties or something. So there's certain content of objectivism that's a lot more threatening to people psychologically. So they just pretend it doesn't exist. They just blank out. And just like way earlier, DD had made an aside about Rand calling stuff altruism in a misleading way, and he never explained that. So it was just this major disagreement with her philosophy, just tossed in as a parenthetical. So yeah, I thought the email was terrible. I thought it was filled with smears and lies, and DD pretending to know what he's talking about. And it also had a negative effect on the world in some small way. Because you see these people now on the Reddit thread going back and forth. And one guy says, I found the first bit to describe why I still found value in Atlas Shrugged in the Fountainhead. And this guy says, I agreed. I guess this was the original poster. Yeah, Ranting Mute says, agreed. I recognized truth and insight in some of her critiques, but incorrectly assumed it meant her philosophy had merit. So DD is helping this guy, Ranting Mute, dismiss Rand. And DD is helping make the world worse. He has no paths forward for correcting his mistakes. And he's helping to make the world a more irrational and evil place. So thanks, DD. I'm going to end the video here. So I realized I hadn't actually commented on this very last part, so I'm going to do that. So I lied about ending the video. So DD says that Rand's only innovation was perhaps her only innovation was to stress much more than anyone before her that free markets are morally superior to socialism and that defending them in terms of efficiency only is to concede much of, she would say, the whole of the opponent's case. And just a thought here, if you concede that markets are immoral, that they are run on the principle of evil greed, that they produce the wicked result of inequality rather, that they are dog eat dog, that they hurt the common man, etc., etc. But then you say oh, but they're efficient, then you are conceding the whole of the case, right? It's like it's like you see it with and Alex Epstein talks about this. If you're like, oh, fossil fuels are terrible, they hurt the environment, um, you know, they're melting the ice caps and raising the oceans, and little island people are gonna drown because we're using so many fossil fuels, and you know, the oil rigs leak into the ocean, and they kill all the little sea animals, the cute little sea animals. Oh, but it's cheap. like it's such an empty defense, you know? Um it doesn't work. And that's why you have the spectacle of a lot of these oil companies, their branding, their marketing, their advertising is like, we hope we can self-terminate our business in 30 years, you know, like it's amazing. They're just like, you know, yes, what we do now is bad, but we can help be more clean and green. Um and so if you try and defend capitalism more broadly in those type of terms, oh well, sure, it's evil, but it's efficient, and maybe we can make it a little nicer or something. No, it doesn't work. Um, and this is another disagreement that DD is jamming into a parenthetical and not, you know, not saying more about really. By the way, I think it's interesting that DD is granting that to stress something to a high degree can be an innovation. And yet, what about her stress on the harmony of men's interests at like an individual level, or her stress on the rational self-interest as the basis of morality, or her stress on reason as the essential guide for living. Rand has had some breakthroughs, but she also put stress on lots of different things, um, in a unique Randian sort of way. And David's basically saying this is like maybe the only thing, this stress about free markets being morally superior to socialism. That's just ridiculous.